Welcome, everybody. This is Mayor Steve Haggerty. I'm pleased to have everyone with us today. This is our series on policing in Evanston. And today's subject is going to be on one that is of interest to many people out there, particularly after what we've seen in the past happen to Eric Garner or George Floyd or others. And that's on the use of force that police use and how they go about using that when they need to. As well as body cameras, which we instituted here in Evanston a few years ago. I'm delighted to have with us Chris Burbank, who is the Vice President of Law Enforcement Strategy for the Center of Policing Equity. And Chris is coming with us from Salt Lake City. So I'll have him give a little more background on himself and the Center for Policy Equity. We have our Police Chief, Demetrius Cook, with us today, and our Deputy Chief, Jody Wright. I do want to make note at the beginning of this session that we had an unusually violent weekend here in Evanston. And a lot of people in our community, our entire community is hurting because of that, particularly the people in the 5th Ward where this violence broke out on Saturday and Sunday. As well as down in the 8th Ward on Howard Street on Thursday. So it's unusual that we have that many homicides here in Evanston. Generally in the last couple of years, it's been about 1 to 3 homicides, and we had 3 in the last week. So I know this is on my mind. I know it's on a lot of people's minds. We have City Council tonight, and the focus area of our City Council meeting before this violent weekend was on policing here in Evanston. And so at the top of that meeting, I am going to, under my mayor announcements, ask Alderman Ruth Simmons to say a few words as the Alderman of the 5th Ward, and I know she has a statement she wants to make, as well as our Police Chief, Demetrius Cook, and Audrey Thompson, our Community Outreach. So more will come on that. So today's session will be on use of force in body cameras. If this is your first time joining us, this is our 4th in a series of conversations we're having. The first one was on police training. The second one was on the Evanston Police Department budget and the conversation around defund the police, which continues to go on across the country and in our community. The last one was on the collaboration between Evanston Police Department and Northwestern University's Police Department, as well as school resource officers at both our elementary school and our high school, so the 2 different school districts. Those are available. You can find them on the city's website if you'd like to review those. I also appreciate the media who's been covering these and putting out articles as well. This is being broadcast live on Facebook Live, and it's also on our local TV station, Channel 16. So lots of great questions that have already come in. What I'd like to do is I'd like to start off with Chris Burbank and just give our audience, Chris, if you would, and usually we have 2,000 to 3,000 people that end up viewing these discussions. Just give them a sense of your background and how you ended up at the Center for Policing Equity and what the mission of that organization is. So welcome.
Oh, absolutely. Let me just first say that I know firsthand the impact that a homicide has on an entire community. We make the mistake of thinking, oh, it's just those specific people involved who may have lost their lives, but it impacts the entire community, and the feeling of safety and well-being, it's paramount in our lives. And so my sympathy to you and your community, and thank you for having me. I spent 25 years in law enforcement, 9 of those as a police chief in Salt Lake City. During that time, I was the vice president of the Major City Chiefs Association, so the 70 largest agencies in the U.S. and Canada. And I am currently the president of the National Executive Institute, which is law enforcement officials who have attended the FBI's National Executive Institute. I have been involved with the Center for Policing Equity, which is a nonprofit action research think tank. I know those are a lot of words, but as we try and describe ourselves, we work with almost 250 agencies across the nation in some way, shape, or form. And what we try and do at the center is use science to examine the intersection between police and community and try to eliminate the bias or the disparity in the outcome that we know exists across the country. And even in circumstances where we do our very best to eliminate it, it somehow still exists. And that's because the racism, the bias, we make the mistake of saying, okay, let's change hearts and minds, which is a very difficult thing to do. When we apply science to it, we can say, well, these are the things that lead to disparity. Let's just stop doing those things, which are much easier to get to.
Now, Chris, your organization, the Center for Policing Equity, has a connection to the Obama Foundation, correct?
Not a connection, they just support us. Mm-hmm. We would love to have a very direct connection to the Obama Foundation. But we are very proud to be one of, I think, 5 organizations that the Obama Foundation said, yes, is a worthwhile organization to help solve the crisis that we're facing in America today.
Well, that's a great endorsement. And just for our audience, that's how we ended up with Chris on here, because as people know, I committed as one of hundreds of mayors around the country to do a review here in our community of use of force. And so when we were looking for a sort of independent third party to join us on these conversations, as we try to do each week, that's how we ended up connecting with you, Chris, and the Center for Policing Equity. So one other question, Chris, are you familiar with the 8 Can't Wait? And I had a lot of people after the murder of George Floyd email me and say, hey, Mayor, 8 Can't Wait. I want to know about, where Evanston stands on these. And we're going to talk about that. I'm going to go to the chief cook next because I want to go through these because so many people inquired about that. But I'm just curious if you had any perspective on those 8 Can't Wait.
Oh, absolutely I do. And I think the thing that is most important, because a little perspective, I began my career about 30 years ago, and there was this little incident in Los Angeles in which Rodney King, and we know the events of that. And you look today at some of the things that we see playing out, and have we improved? Have we changed the outcome? And that is the mistake that we have made time and time again. In between that event and now, we have had tremendous discussion about how policing should change. We have had lots of insight, monumental training, but have we changed the outcome? And now is the time to change the outcome. So as you look at the 8 and other good suggestions, our hope at the Center for Policing Equity is just that we start to institute these things. If we try and make this, we're going to solve all the problems at once, very difficult to do. But there's a few out there. We ought to just start down the road, and as you can cross them off the list, you are that much further ahead of anyone else in the nation.
Great. So I'm gonna go to the chief now, and Chief, I want to do a quick round robin on the 8 Can't Wait, and then I'm going to go back to Chris and just ask him for any perspective he has after listening to you, and then we're going to get to the audience's questions that people have emailed us, some of which I may have been related to these 8 Can't Wait. So first one, 8 Can't Wait, is about chokeholds and strangleholds, Chief. In the city of Evanston, do our officers use chokeholds or strangleholds?
No, sir. Chokeholds is banned in our general orders. They've been banned in there. It's a universal ban if an agency has Lexapol policies. The ban of chokeholds is in our general orders.
All right, excellent. Second one is about requiring de-escalation. I know we talked about this on our first session that we had around training. But so I'll ask the question straight up. In Evanston, do we require officers to de-escalate situations?
Yes, sir. De-escalation is critical when it comes to preventing force. We have, I think, 89 officers here trained in critical incident training, and a big portion of that is de-escalation. And de-escalation in a number of areas: suicide prevention, mental health, and things of that nature. How to not make a small incident a big one.
Okay. The third one is about requiring warnings before shooting. And so, question, does Evanston require a verbal warning in all situations before using deadly force?
Yes, if practical, if the officer's life or no one else's life is in jeopardy, the officer should be given warnings with the use of force.
Mhm. And Chief, if use of force is ever occurs, any kind of use of force, and I know this is I'm jumping down the list, but I think it's appropriate to talk about it now. Do Evanston officers, and this is the eighth one on 8 Can't Wait, do Evanston officers have to report each time they use of force or threaten to use of force against a civilian?
Yes, we have a use of force report that is required by all officers when they utilize force.
And can you talk to our viewers about what happens to that report? So the officer completes it. Do you see it? I mean, who sees it there and asks the questions? And the reason I ask that question now is because it does get to the point about, requiring a warning before shooting. Presumably, I would expect that question and all those kind of details is going to be in that report, second by second, what happened here to get to the point where force had to be used.
Yes, sir. When we get that use of force report, it goes up through the chain to the Office of Professional Standards, and that triggers a review of the video. And we can see a number of things from the review of that video, not only with respect to the actual use of force, but any other infractions we see in the viewing of that video. We take care of that. It comes up to my office. If it's a recommendation for discipline needed, it goes back down to the supervisor, and then it comes up as a formal a departmental inquiry into that particular incident.
Chief, is there a statewide database that you have to enter information into if use of force is used?
I'm sorry. It's statewide. It's not a statewide database, but the FBI has, and maybe Chris can talk to that. They have a database that we do enter our use of forces into.
Okay, so I'm going to go to Chris at the end when we get through these questions, and he can add anything here. So to the requiring comprehensive reporting, the bottom line is yes. In Evanston, officers have to report each time they use of force or threaten to use of force against a civilian.
Just to clarify, Mayor, so anytime there is a use of force or even an allegation made by someone and we came in contact with an allegation of injury, even if there was no force used because there was an allegation, we still do a use of force report.
Okay.
Now, the officer threatens the use of force, and that use of force is not by a weapon or anything like that, just to give commands in order for compliance. If there was no force used, a use of force is not required in that situation.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Deputy Chief. Right. Okay. So we're going to go to the fourth question, or the fourth of the 8 Can't Wait. Does Evanston require all officers to exhaust all other alternatives, including non-force and less lethal force options, prior to resorting to deadly force?
So as far as what's stated in the policy, no, it's not required that you exhaust all efforts. Every use of force situation is unique, and some situations are more complex than others. Officers are trained to use enough force to defeat the threat that they're encountering with at the time. And in doing so, they take a look at the totality of the circumstance of that particular situation. So it may not be feasible for an officer to confront a threat of deadly force with something that would not defeat that threat, meaning we wouldn't have expect an officer to use OC or pepper spray if they're confronted with deadly force. So no, they do not have to exhaust all measures in order to escalate to the level of force that's needed, but they should use the force that's necessary to defeat the threat and make the arrest.
Yep. So let's jump then to the seventh criteria of their 8, because you started to talk about it, Deputy Chief, which is, requiring the use of force continuum. And do we use the use of force continuum in Evanston, which I think you were describing there, and talk to our viewers about what this use of force continuum is, because it's a methodology and approach that police departments use all over the country.
So the use of force continuum itself is just a policy or a practice that an officer has some predetermined force options to use to defeat a threat. Meaning, if you're met with, let's say, verbal or some non-aggressive resistance, the continuum pretty much dictates a guideline. It's not absolute, but a guideline on where you should enter that situation. So in years past, people will look at a continuum and think it's an escalation up, the use of force, but it's also an escalation down as well. So you may be met with a level of force that may dictate you to use a higher level, but with de-escalation training, just because you go in that situation and the beginning of that situation requires a higher level of force, you can move down a continuum based on verbal commands and direction.
Okay. Thank you. I think it would be good. I'm sure it's already out there. There's a diagram that demonstrates what you were just talking about with the use of force continuum. If it hasn't been in any of our past packages, the next time we do a human services committee meeting with policing and forces on there, I definitely want to put that out there. I want people to see and understand that continuum with a graphic. All right. This is on the minds of a lot of folks, and this is the fifth criteria on 8 can't wait, is a duty to intervene. And this is on the minds because, we see, if I just use George Floyd as an example, a guy who can't breathe, says it multiple times, other officers there, and nobody intervenes to stop the situation. So in Evanston, does Evanston require officers to intervene and stop excessive force and report incidents?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The Evanston Police Department specifically has the general order, and it is entitled duty to intervene. Now, in law enforcement, this has been something that we have really been not really good at. Years ago in the 80s, we would have calls and there'd be 10 police officers there. A situation would go down, and when it got to the complaint level, everybody would say, I was there, but I was looking over here, or my attention was drawn over there. Well, that accountability is with these officers now. And when you see a situation that is improper, it is your duty to stop it and report it to your immediate supervisor. And we hold people accountable to the utmost level of that when we look at these situations. And body camera video has greatly aided us in being able to determine how far up the chain with that accountability with respect to the people who's on the scene.
Okay. All right. And I know we're going to talk about body cameras in a minute because there are lots of questions about body cameras. And if you're also thinking about, again, duty to intervene or the reporting of incidents, any complaints that are filed, go through the Office of Professional Review, but also go to the Citizen Police Review Commission, which I, as mayor, appoint, and the City Council approves, which they did just recently. So any complaints ultimately go to that Citizen Commission as well. The sixth criteria is about shooting at moving vehicles. Does Evanston ban shooting at moving vehicles?
Well, we follow the state law with respect to that. If you shoot at a moving vehicle, it should be a deadly force. You should be able to articulate deadly force. If the vehicle is trying to run the officer over, the officer can use deadly force in that situation. But as a practice, you should be very careful with that if you can't articulate that deadly force was required.
And so, Chief, take us through. So say an officer used deadly force against a moving vehicle, can articulate it very well. In your judgment, there were absolutely other options in the continuum that officer could have deployed. What happens? What happens in that situation?
It's an investigation into that incident, a review of all mediums, body camera from every officer that may have been on the scene. In-car camera video is reviewed. That video is compared to what the officer writes in his field general, and any supplementary reports. We look for the inconsistencies there, and then based upon the facts, when it gets to my office, we determine an appropriate level of discipline.
Okay. All right. And so that was number 6. We already covered number 7, which was requiring a use of force continuum, which Evanston does. Answered affirmatively. They do use force of continuing here. And then the 8th one was requiring comprehensive reporting, and every Evanston officer has to report each time they use force against civilians. And so that was answered affirmatively. There was the nuance to the threaten to use force, which officer or Deputy Commissioner Chief Wright discussed there on that. So, Chris, you've heard the responses to these, 8 can't wait. Do you have anything you'd want to add, or areas where you think, hey, Evanston, maybe you should think about this or think about that?
Well, what I will point to directly is the answers that the chief gave were very similar to answers that come across the nation, right? Some of these things have been in place for years and years. Some are a little more recent, but many are following this practice. But what we still see is an outcome in which there is tremendous disparity, and we have problems with the outcome. We see people time and time again, in essence, abusing this system. This is more about the expectation that we as a society have for law enforcement and the rules by which they operate. And so I'm not saying anything that we just discussed is bad, but those are all standards by which the officers operate. But what we see time and time again, is it worth somebody dying over selling CDs or cigarettes or a traffic violation? Right? We're not talking about the robber who's escaping from the bank and the police encounter them and those types of things. No, these horrible incidents that we see are the results of situations in which we need to ask ourselves, is that the best use of the resource that we call policing? And we as a society, you as a community, need to start taking a look scientifically and measuring, right, the data that you have available, utilize that to say, this is what's producing the negative outcome, and these are the things that are maybe reducing that. We have been very poor at measuring the success of policy, practice, and training that we put into place in policing. We put it into place, and then we say, oh, our measurement is, did crime go up or down? Well, the correlation between all that police do and the crime rate is very slim, and there's no scientific evidence. So let's start looking at what we can control, right? And what the outcome is of this, again, resource that we have available to us. And then we decide as a community, this is how we want to be policed and interact.
It's a great point. It's a great point. So thank you. We had a question from Terry. How is the ban on chokeholds monitored? Now, Chief, you made it very clear that it's against policy here in Evanston for an officer to use chokeholds or strangleholds. But her question is, how do we monitor that that's not occurring?
Well, we, first of all, we educate the officers about that. So, it's no doubt about whether or not a chokehold is permissible or any obstruction of the airway during an arrest. But we do see from, some of the audits that we do with respect to the video, and when I say video, I mean the body camera video, and even the in-car video, that when these officers do these takedowns, sometimes inadvertently it turns into a chokehold to get the person down to the ground. And when you have those situations, you got to take decisive action. And we do that here. But anything that comes to our attention through the complaint process, or even through an ambulance run, if somebody is complaining about my neck is hurting and things of that nature, it's the supervisor's responsibility to address that and make sure that it gets to the appropriate investigating committee. It would be the Office of Professional Standards.
Thank you. And I think that it's important for the viewers to know, because you just referred to it, that as part of sort of quality assurance and monitoring, you do, or you have a team that periodically or regularly samples body-worn camera video to see if proper practices are being followed.
Yes, sir. We take action a lot of times on video that nobody has even complained about. And if it's a situation where it could be a tort or some liability associated with that video footage that we've reviewed, not only are we taking action here, we're sending it over to the legal department so that they can start to address, once a person is wrong, I think it's our responsibility also to make sure that that person is whole also.
Okay. All right. Lots of questions from the residents here in Evanston. So I want to get to those now. Melissa asks, what is the entire procedure for body camera filming and viewing? So let's start with this question, because I know this is on the minds of some. As a bystander, may I film the police, interaction with somebody? And question two, as a either a victim of a crime or somebody that called in an incident, and I'm part of it, I'm a subject, I'm part of it, can I film you?
Yes. A person has a right to film the police. We're public. I like to say we're public property. And, the citizens have a right to film us. What happens a lot of times, and we've just addressed a situation with respect to what we're talking about now, is when the person filming gets in the way of what is actually going on, and it could be termed that person is interfering or jeopardizing the safety of the officers taking the video. Now, the officer's response to that should be to kindly ask the person to film at a distance that's appropriate, but in no way should the policeman be hijacking the person's phone.
Okay. All right. And talk to us about the procedure for the body cameras, which all your officers wear. So this was something you pilot tested with Northwestern University. We talked about that at the last session that we had, and the city council made the investment. It was something that the police wanted. It was something that activists wanted for greater accountability and transparency. So how does that work? All of our officers have body-worn camera videos. When are they on? When are they off? How do you, have you had an incident where something happened and somebody didn't put their, body-worn camera on, and what happens to that officer in that situation?
Yes, sir. Yes, Evanston, every police officer has a body-worn camera, and the use of those cameras are governed by state law and also in our general orders. Now, when a police officer leaves the station, his body camera should be on. Having it off in the station is an exception. Once they get in the squad car, they can turn it off. But once they exit the squad car, the video must be on. And that video, these cameras are designed to run for up to 10 hours. And that is law, state law here, that we have to be able to record for 10 hours on our video cameras. When there's an incident or a complaint, the supervisor will check the video to see actually what happened and determine whether or not he should start an investigation. When we interact with the public in any way, the video camera should be rolling. Exceptions being if we enter into a residence, the resident has the right to say, I prefer you not have that video on. But while a police officer is in that house, if some violence erupts, the officer has the right to turn the video camera on again and start recording. That having that video is the officer's responsibility. And when we get incidents where, and a lot of things happen with these videos, where police officers try to circumvent what's on that video. But my perspective is, if you don't have that video, it's going to be corrective action in terms of discipline with you. And then I'm going to lean toward more what the citizen is saying with respect to what happens.
And so when an officer leaves their vehicle, their camera has to be on. And let's say they pulled me over, and do they need to make a verbal command to me or to let me know that it is being videotaped by them, or is it just understood by people in the public like any of us can be videotaped these days?
Yeah, so if an officer approaches you, whether it's on a traffic stop or any, let's say, public contact on the street, the first thing they should do is just introduce themselves and let them know that they are audio and video recording the incident. Just for some clarification, I know you asked about what officers record. So any law enforcement contact would be recorded. Only things that they don't record are if I'm just out downtown Evanston and I approach a citizen and there's just casual conversation, there's no law enforcement intent, then that conversation wouldn't be recorded because it's just a casual conversation between two people, a public official and a citizen, and there isn't any enforcement action that needs to be taken. As far as the video cameras being on when they leave the station, every time you turn the camera on, it's in buffer mode. So the camera is on, but it isn't recording at that particular time until the police activate. So it is in buffer mode as soon as they leave the station.
What do you call it? What kind of mode?
I'm sorry, this is called buffering mode. So our cameras are set up to where once the police officers activate the recording actually starts 30 seconds prior to when a police officer presses that button to record. So the camera is always buffering, collecting that information, and it's not stored on the camera or in the cloud, as we like to call it, unless the recording is activated.
So let's walk through the viewers. I know lots of people have this question. I would guess that the vast majority of interactions that the police have with the public, nobody's arrested. And yet it's captured on body-worn camera video. My understanding of the law is that if any of us are arrested, anyone can FOIA using the Freedom of Information Act and see that videotape.
That's correct.
Okay, but the vast majority of people who have interactions with the police may be captured on body-worn camera, but have not been arrested. Can anybody see that? I mean, could I, if the police were at my neighbor's house last night, could I say, hey, I'd like to see, but nobody was arrested. Could I say, hey, could I see that body-worn camera video?
No. So we have what's considered, like you said, what's FOIable, meaning, any arrest. So if an arrest is made, just like we do our daily bulletins and there are announcements that an arrest was made, we identified what the crime was, give a location of where it happened, and then sometimes the individual's name. That's all public record once the arrest was made. So that body-worn camera falls up under that as well. So if a police officer has a law enforcement contact and arrest is made, that information is now foyable to anyone who wants to see that interaction. However, if I came to your house, let's just say it was a complaint, and there's just conversation, that interaction was recorded, based on your acknowledgement that you're doing recording and you didn't object to it. That is a private recording between the police officer and the citizen. So even if you wanted to, as the neighbor, to retrieve that video, you couldn't, because it wouldn't be considered public record. Now, if the person that I had contact with wanted to view that video, they could call the police department and say, I had this interaction with the police last night. It was just me and a police officer. I would like to have that video, because they were a party in that conversation or subject in that conversation. Then that video can be disclosed or released to that individual only.
Okay. So if you're not arrested and there's body-worn camera video that's captured of your interaction with the police, the only people that can see that video is the subject of the video or his or her attorney, if they had an attorney and they wanted to look at it. But
Right. And if the person
mayor doesn't get to see it, none of your elected officials get to see it, anything like that. Hey, Chris, how common are body cameras in police departments nationwide?
Well, they're becoming more and more common. So I was one of the first agencies in Salt Lake City, and I was just thinking, I think it was 10 years ago that I went to a full deployment and was involved in discussion with chiefs across the country about best practices policy and how you put that into place. Some of what you just discussed. So retention, how long are you keeping things? What is publicly accessible? And then how do you review or make a determination are the three big questions that exist right now. And there's some states that have not even allowed this to take place. And so now it's just looping around. I mean, you're on the second or third wave or initiative for body cameras. And so it's very important, your state has gone a long way to addressing some of the policy and privacy concerns surrounding body camera footage and those things. Some states are just barely starting down this road. The one thing that I always caution, though, which is so important, body cameras do not tell the truth. Body cameras give you a factual representation of what took place. So in describing your wall, Mayor, behind you, is that cream? Is that yellow? Is that off-white? Right? My perception may be very different than yours. So what you've got, right, is a body camera, a factual representation. You have the statement of the officer involved. You have the statement of the citizen involved. Putting that together, then you start getting close to an actual truth of what took place. And so I always caution, because this does not solve the problem. Right? Going back to my initial reference, right? Rodney King was videotaped, that entire incident, right? This has existed in law enforcement, but yet we've still had the abuses take place. And when you look at the Floyd incident, officer knew very well that he was being recorded. And so these are the types of things, yes, they're very good tools, but they're just one of the things that we need to use to change the outcome of policing.
How have body cameras changed policing?
Well, I think we've seen some statistics across the country that show in agencies that utilize body cameras, you have fewer complaints, right? The complaints, the citizen, the run-of-the-mill citizen complaints, officers were rude, right? They were impolite, they had no reason to stop me, and those things. I think we've seen traditionally a decline in those types of complaints. And the nice thing is, as Chief Cook can attest to, right, the majority of police officers in this country go out with the intent to do a good job. It's the criteria in which we send them out that causes the problems. So good science shows that if you measure the bias, the individual disparity that exists in each of us, right? My tendency to be racist or biased, and you determine the outcome would be X, the outcome is always much greater than that, because the policy, the practice, and the procedure in which we send officers out has much more impact on the outcome and the bias than the individual officers. And so that's, again, looking at what is the practice under which we utilize these cameras. If your practice is poor and you allow some of the things, that the 8 prohibited and those types of things, well, then you're just filming bad behavior, and it doesn't change the standard by which you're operating under. So it is a combination of things, and you just don't want to fall into the trap that, oh, that'll solve all our problems. We put it on the camera, our officers, and everyone behaves.
Right. It's not a panacea.
Absolutely not.
Chief Cook, Elizabeth asked, who is in charge of downloading body camera footage and who has access to it? Great question.
Once an officer's tour of duty is over, they put their body cameras into the charger and it automatically downloads the video to the cloud. Now, the only person that has access to that video is the Officer of Professional Standards and our in-house IT officer. None of that video that's uploaded can be manipulated or erased.
Okay. Neil asked, what is the process used to spot check officers' body cameras monthly?
So,
I presume you do it monthly. I don't know. So if you could talk to us about, how you go about spot checking, video, and then, again, how that's either used in disciplining or retraining officers or used for your overall training that you're doing to the whole cadre.
yeah, so it is done monthly. So every sergeant is assigned like an administrative officer pool. So that sergeant is responsible for spot checking at least 3 of those officers' videos per month. So the way it works is we have our CAD system and our RMS, which generates our calls for service. The officer supervisors will go and they will get their officers' calls for service. And then they will look at those calls for service and determine which one of those calls for service would require, most times all of them will require body camera activation. It could be a disturbance, a traffic stop, anything like that. So what they'll do is they'll just randomly pick any of those videos that require, any of those situations that require body-worn camera activation, and then they will check and see if that officer, as well as any of the officers on the scene, activated their body cameras. If it was a situation where the body camera should have been activated and it wasn't, it is grounds for discipline, and we have disciplined officers in the past for this. Now it's kind of like a zero tolerance because we're now more than 2 years into this body-worn camera implementation or full deployment. So officers should be well aware of when the body camera should be activated. So if a supervisor comes across the scene, a situation where the body camera should have been activated and they look at and see it wasn't, then we do give discipline. That discipline does gradually increase depending on the officer and how many infractions they have had in the past.
So Neil,
Can I jump in? Question, man? What's your retention policy? How long do you maintain videos? And is there a different schedule depending on whether it's an arrest or non-arrest or an incident that rises to a review?
We do. So there are several levels of retention. If it's just an ordinary interaction between me and you, let's just say there was no arrest made, that is retained for at minimum of 90 days. So just a regular recording, nothing, no extenuating circumstances, no arrest, 90 days. If there was an arrest made, the minimum retention will be 2 years, and that would depend on how far or how the case advanced in court. Some cases, in Cook County may take longer than that, so we do modify that to make sure that any evidence that's necessary for court we keep for at least 2 years. It goes the same for internal complaints. If someone makes a complaint against an officer, that video is kept for a period, I believe it's 5 years, 2 to 5 years. But I mean, even to go further. So we have here at the Evanston Police Department, we have an interaction with a citizen, and we're not sure, but we think that interaction may lead to a complaint down the road. We make the officer do a report and document that interaction, even if the complaint hasn't come in yet. And then we tag that video to make sure that video is saved for 2 years as opposed to the 90-day period.
And what a lot of people don't know is the Cook County State's Attorney has a portal into our video, our Axon body-worn camera video. So we can send, and the State's Attorney can view video from the State's Attorney's office with respect to cases that may be of great interest to them.
Neil had a follow-up question. How many officers have been caught not meeting the department's rules on body camera usage since the inception of the program, and what are the penalties for those officers? And somebody else had asked that question. When did we start using body cameras with all the officers here in Evanston? You know,
that happened. I want to say like 2018. I wasn't here then.
that sounds about right, because it happened when I was on the city council.
But we do have that data because, and when you're looking at organizational culture, when you want people to do a specific thing, we constantly preach, have your body camera video on. So I got zero tolerance for not having it. When I get a complaint, if I don't have the video from the officer, and as Chris said, it don't paint the whole picture. But when I look at the situation in totality, what the citizen may have said in their complaint, what was documented in the police reports, what any witnesses may have said, and the video footage, I can get a good picture as to where we're going to go in terms of discipline. But if an officer does not have that video, even if he's right in his dissertation of what happened, he's still going to receive discipline for not having that video.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Mary Ann asked the question, when an officer has to use deadly force, do they shoot to kill or to disable?
Well, anytime you firing a handgun at somebody, that's shooting to kill. The public is under the notion that a police officer is trained or should be trained to shoot a person in the leg or in the hand. I've had people say, he should have shot him in the hand. The use of a weapon is deadly force. So officers are trained to stop the threat and to utilize only the force necessary to stop that threat.
She asks, are all police officers and affiliated staff trained as sharpshooters?
Well, we don't use that designation, sharpshooter. We follow the state of Illinois, the state police firearms training qualification course. That is required once a year, but we do numerous range events. We also have simulator training that we utilize here in the police department, where they have real life simulations of use of force situations. As you know, I'm scheduling your citizen complaint review committee to go into the virtual simulator so that they can get an idea of the complexity of use of force.
Okay. Any thoughts on that, Chris? What was just discussed in terms of police officers being trained when they have to use the most excessive force in their weapon?
Well, so we make the mistake of saying it is the training that the officers receive that make the final outcome. And yes, that's true. But what you want to look at is what is the criteria under which we utilize deadly force in the statute? Because that's the level that officers are trained to. And so instead of asking the question kind of after the fact, why didn't you, why shouldn't you, right? We should start asking the question because they're saying, is the use of force necessary? Is that necessity immediate? And does it take into account the totality of the circumstance? Did the officer put themselves in the situation or cause the need for deadly force to be utilized. And then going back to where, I talked earlier, what about those situations? Maybe we shouldn't be there, right? And those are hard questions to answer. But if we're going to change the end product, right, the outcome, we need to evaluate the criteria under which we hire and use deadly force, not just that moment in time. We make the mistake of looking at 30 seconds and saying, oh, we should have, could have, right? And that also works back the other way. You see officers that we as the public go, well, wait a minute, that's definitely against the law. And a court says, oh, no, that's good, right? Or an attorney, right? That is because under the law, they're looking at that moment in time, not the totality and the necessity of that use of force. So I think we need to take a broader look at some of these things if we're actually going to change the outcome. And I'm not talking, right, this is where officers get nervous, right? I'm not talking about playing a gotcha game with the police. I'm talking about we go through, we systematically change the standard by which we use deadly force, and that's what we train officers to. We're not going back and catching them, right? We're going to change who we bring in the door and the criteria under which they operate.
How have tasers change the use of someone's weapon? I mean, the taser is also a weapon, I suppose, but it presumably is not lethal like a shot would be. So can you talk a little, Chris, about how that's changed? And then, Chief, I just want you to talk about the use of tasers here in Evanston and any guidelines around that.
So tasers are a tool. They're not a substitute for deadly force, but they have been accountable for a reduction in force in some agencies that have utilized them. We made the mistake when we instituted taser type weapons as saying it can be anywhere from, oh, you look at me funny, to a substitute for deadly force. And very bad case law, unfortunate deaths of members of the public, we've resulted in active or aggressive resistance, right? It's a tool that has some dangers involved in it. It doesn't solve everything. And so the criteria, right, should have been there in the beginning, not all over the map as we started. And it's a mistake that we make in policing, right? There's not a standard. Ask your fire department what the standard is or the distance from a fire hydrant or a station to a business to anything else. They'll quote it off the top of their head. Every captain in the town will. Well, what's the police standard? I'll bet you'll get 40 different standards or more just in your state alone. We can do a better job there.
Chief, you have any thoughts on tasers in Evanston that you wanted to talk to? Or I've got a few more questions I want to get to before we wrap up the hour.
Yeah, a taser is on the use of force continuum. No matter what level of force you utilize, you have to be able to articulate and justify your reasoning for using a taser. And that all has to fit in the state law. As Chris said, a taser improperly used can be a hazard. But fortunately, the device provides a lot of data in terms of how it was used, how long a person was tased, was that tasing of that person within the guidelines of state law? Did the officer tase the person when there were other hazards that jeopardized the citizen's life and things of that nature? For instance, you don't want to tase somebody standing up on a porch and the stairs are right there. You could create additional hazards there. But they have been effective in the proper application of it when it's utilized within the bounds of the law.
Okay. Can a resident tell you that they don't want it videotaped or audio taped, and will you turn your camera and audio off?
You talking about the body camera, man?
Yeah, now I'm moving back to the body camera. Just somebody had that question about if I have an interaction with the police and you come up and you say, you're being filmed and audio tape. If I say, no, I don't want that, will it be turned off?
Yes, sir. If you're if you're a witness, or if you're just a good citizen, want to talk to the police officer And when he greets you, he tells you that his body camera is on, and a person says, "Oh, can you turn that off?" The officer should accommodate that.
Okay, but the situation, let's say I was pulled over, suspected of something, and I say, "Oh, I don't want that videotape on." It stays on.
Yes, sir. It stays on. The officer he has to have that camera roll.
Okay, all right, and that's by law, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. If someone thought, this is Fortino asked this question, how can people be sure that an encounter with the police is documented accurately? When we talked about the body camera footage and all that, so I think we've covered all of that. But in terms of, the police have, write up a whole report that they have. Do residents have a right to see that police report, and how does all that?
Yes, a citizen that is the subject of a police incident has a right to see the police report. And, I have people come down here all the time, and they say, "Oh, well, chief, I can't afford to give you that $5 or whatever." Give them the police report. But how we analyze truth is based on the totality of all of the evidence that we get. Body camera, in-car camera, witnesses, the victim statement, what the police officer says in the investigation versus what he wrote in his police report. All of that is taken into account. And after I review that stuff, after it comes from the Office of Professional Standards, I make a determination as to what I think happened. And then we have a sit down with the Office of Professional Standards, the deputy chiefs, and myself, and we look at the incident to make sure that we all on the same page.
Okay. Final question from Fortino, and then I'm going to wrap it up with a final question for Chris. Is there a code of silence in the Evanston Police Department, Chief?
I would like to say the code of silence exists in law enforcement. That is still an issue. I've been a police officer. I'm in my 40th year. It was an issue when I initially started. It still continues to be an issue. But I think through holding officers accountable in the investigative process, I think being honest with respect to transparency with the citizens, transparency in filling FOIA information properly, I think that way we can cut that down. That, some of these issues that we're dealing with in law enforcement today have been in existence forever, and now I think we're making headway with solving some of these problems. Some of these issues were addressed years ago. If you go back to the independent commission report on the Los Angeles Police Department, and that was the report that gave examples to the Rodney King incident. If we had stuck with some of those findings, we'd be better off today. If we follow what the NAACP and the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police, the 10 tenets that they ask law enforcement to ascribe to when it comes to dealing with the public, we'll be in a better place. 21st century policing, if we had followed that, we'd be in a better place. But now I'm glad that we have agencies like what Chris is representing, think tanks, PERT, that challenges what we do so that we can come out here and fulfill our ultimate goal, and that is to give good, clean police service to the public.
Right. We had one other question before I go to Chris from Claire, who had asked, what's the procedure with dashboard cameras that are on the police department cars? We didn't talk about that. So
Yeah.
are those always on? How does that work? When the car's on, the dashboard camera's on, what happens to that?
They operate pretty much, we have the same company, Axon cameras. So the in-car cameras are in buffer. those cameras are activated in a number of ways. If a police officer turns his lights on, the camera is activated. If the officer reaches a certain speed, is activated. And I think that's all in the interest of the public on how these cameras are activated. We'll have situations where officers will respond to a scene and they won't activate their lights. But if they exceed the speed limit, the camera is going to be activated and I'm going to know about it.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Chief. I'd like to wrap it up with some thoughts from Chris. I mean, you've spent an hour now with us. Chris, you probably didn't know much about the Evanston Police Department before this conversation. I really appreciate you taking some time, in your work with the Center for Policing Equity. Having listened to this conversation, any strategies or thoughts you want to leave us with as a community? And you have a nice perch, right? Because you see police departments all over the country. And again, for an hour, you heard about ours. Again, primarily focused in the area of use of force. But I'd welcome, I know the viewers would welcome any parting thoughts or strategies that you have that we ought to be thinking about as a community.
Oh, absolutely. And let me just say, it's been a pleasure to be with you. I think the most important things that we need to do is we need to gather the data that everything that we do, we have it analyzed by third party, and we make that public. And we use that as the criteria as to which we evaluate the effectiveness of policing. Right? That will have tremendous impact on the outcome. And then one final word about the thin blue line or this code of silence. If as a young recruit, I see the actions of officers that are not addressed by administrators time and time again, and I see the force, I see negative comments, and nothing takes place, why am I going to risk myself and step in to avoid that? So I would always argue that the best route through the code of silence is good, consistent, discipline's such a hard term, but being a police officer in this nation and serving the communities such as yours is a privilege, not a right. You are not entitled to that. And it comes with tremendous responsibility. And anyone who violates that responsibility should no longer be a police officer in Evanston, anywhere in the state of Illinois, or anywhere in this nation. And that will change the outcome.
Excellent. Thank you for those parting words. That was Chris Burbank, the Vice President of Law Enforcement Strategy for the Center for Policing Equity, and also happened to be the former Chief of Police for Salt Lake City, Utah. Chief Cook and Deputy Chief Wright, thank you for taking time with us on a particularly busy day. We'll see you this evening at the Evanston City Council meeting. As always, I appreciate our city staff who work behind the scenes to help us put on this production. Next week, we'll be back for this series, and our focus will be on the complaint process and the findings and recommendations from the task force that looked at the city's complaint process. So until then, be well, everyone, and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Good to meet you all.
Yes, sir.